The emperor's voice crackled through radio speakers across the Japanese archipelago, his words floating over a nation in ruins. August 15th, 1945. The war was over. In factories, hospitals, and communication centers throughout the home islands, young Japanese women stood frozen, their hands trembling as they processed what they had just heard. The divine emperor himself had spoken of surrender, of bearing the unbearable. Yuki Tanaka, a 22-year-old nurse from Hiroshima, pressed her back against the hospital wall, her white uniform stained with the blood of countless wounded soldiers. Around her, other women wept openly. Some tore at their hair, others fell to their knees. The shame was crushing, suffocating. For 3 years they had been told that death was preferable to surrender, that the Americans were demons who would defile and destroy everything sacred about Japan. Michiko Sato, a radio operator from Tokyo, sat motionless at her communications desk as static filled her headphones. Her family had been vaporized in the firebombing months earlier. Now, even her purpose, her duty to the emperor, had crumbled to ash. The propaganda broadcasts she had transmitted for years suddenly felt like lies echoing in an empty room. Her fingers, once swift across the radio dials, now trembled over silent equipment. In the textile factories of Osaka, Keiko Yamamoto and dozens of other young women stood among silent looms, their hands still covered in grease from manufacturing parachute silk for kamikaze pilots. The machines that had hummed day and night for the war effort now sat motionless, their mechanical breathing finally stilled. The women stared at each other with hollow eyes, unsure whether they were witnessing liberation or damnation. Some still wore the protective goggles that had shielded them from flying sparks, now useless accessories in a world without purpose. Across the archipelago, similar scenes unfolded in countless workplaces. In aircraft factories where women had riveted fighter planes, in munitions plants where they had packed artillery shells, in communication centers where they had decoded messages from the front lines. Each woman faced the same devastating realization. Everything they had sacrificed, everything they had believed, had led to this moment of ultimate disgrace. In the days that followed, chaos descended like a dark fog. American forces swept across the islands, their boots echoing through empty streets where cherry blossoms had once fallen like snow. The women who had served as nurses, radio operators, factory workers, and clerical staff found themselves gathered in makeshift assembly points. They clutched small bundles containing their few remaining possessions, a photograph of family, a worn kimono, perhaps a letter from a brother who would never return from the Pacific. The orders came swift and impersonal. They were to be transported for processing, classified as civilian auxiliaries who had supported the war effort. The women exchanged terrified glances, their minds racing with stories they had heard whispered in the darkness. American soldiers were beasts, they had been told. They would strip away not just their clothes, but their honor, their very souls. The propaganda had painted vivid pictures of torture chambers, of experiments conducted on living subjects, of fates worse than the honorable death they should have chosen. At the ports of Yokohama and Kobe, long lines of women waited under the watchful eyes of American guards. The contrast was jarring. Where Japanese soldiers had always screamed orders, these foreigners spoke in measured tones. Where brutality had been expected, there was an almost bureaucratic efficiency that felt more unsettling than violence might have been. The Americans carried clipboards instead of swords, counted heads instead of taking them. Yuki found herself standing next to Michiko in the processing line, their shared terror creating an invisible bond. Both had heard the same stories, absorbed the same propaganda. The Americans would torture them, experiment on them, use them as examples of Japanese weakness. The shame of capture was already unbearable. What followed would surely be worse than death. They had been taught that a Japanese woman's purity was more precious than life itself, and now they were about to lose both. The ships loomed before them like metal mountains, their hulls painted in the gray of war. American sailors moved efficiently along the decks, preparing for a cargo of human uncertainty. As the women were herded up the gangplanks, many wept silently, their tears mixing with the salt spray from the harbor. Behind them, Japan grew smaller on the horizon, a land of ash and broken dreams. Ahead lay the unknown, an ocean that stretched toward a country they had been taught to fear more than death itself. The engines rumbled to life beneath their feet, and the great ships began their journey across the Pacific. In the crowded holds below deck, hundreds of Japanese women huddled together, whispering prayers to ancestors they might never see again. The metal walls sweated with condensation, and the air grew thick with the scent of fear and seasickness. Many had never been on a ship before, and the rolling motion sent waves of nausea through their already weakened bodies. Yuki pressed herself against the cold steel bulkhead, trying to find stability in a world that had lost all moorings. Beside her, Michiko clutched a small photograph of her parents, the edges worn soft from countless touches. Neither woman spoke of what awaited them across the ocean, but both understood that they were sailing toward their own destruction. The photograph trembled in Michiko's hands as she traced her mother's face with a fingertip, wondering if she would ever see that gentle smile again. The ship's hull groaned against the Pacific swells, a sound that seemed to echo the collective anguish of its human cargo. Women from every corner of Japan found themselves pressed together in this floating prison. Farmers' daughters from Kyushu who had worked in ammunition factories, teachers from Hokkaido who had operated radio equipment, silk workers from rural villages who had sewn parachutes for pilots they would never meet. Their regional dialects blended into a chorus of shared misery. The American sailors who brought them food seemed like giants from another world. Their uniforms were clean, their faces well-fed, their movements confident. They distributed tin plates filled with rice and vegetables, portions larger than anything the women had seen in months. The rice was white, pure white, not the mixture of barley and sweet potato they had grown accustomed to during the war's final hungry years. Some prisoners stared at the food suspiciously, convinced it must be poisoned or drugged. Others devoured it desperately, their bodies overriding their minds' protests. "They want us strong for whatever they plan to do to us," whispered Keiko, picking at her rice with trembling fingers. The other women nodded grimly, their imaginations filling with horrors worse than death. They had been taught that Americans were savages who delighted in cruelty, who viewed Japanese women as objects to be broken and discarded. The propaganda films had shown American soldiers laughing as they destroyed sacred temples, desecrating everything pure about Japanese culture. As the days passed, the women began to notice details that didn't align with their expectations. The sailors never struck them, never shouted. When one elderly woman collapsed from exhaustion, an American medic treated her with surprising gentleness, administering medicine and ensuring she received extra rations. The women watched this interaction with bewilderment, their worldview trembling like a house built on sand. Was this elaborate theater designed to lull them into false security before the real torment began? Through small portholes, they caught glimpses of the endless Pacific, its surface stretching unbroken to every horizon. Some women pressed their faces to the glass, watching dolphins race alongside the ship, their playful leaps a stark contrast to the gravity of human cargo below. The ocean that had once protected Japan now carried them toward an uncertain fate, each wave taking them further from everything they had ever known. The water was impossibly blue, cleaner than anything they remembered from their polluted harbors back home. Yuki began keeping a small diary, scratching words onto scraps of paper with a pencil stub she had hidden in her belongings. "Day 3, she wrote. "The Americans have not harmed us. I do not understand. Perhaps they saved their cruelty for when we reach their land. The food is better than what we ate even before the war became desperate. This confuses me more than brutality would." Her hand shook as she wrote, the pencil leaving uncertain marks on the paper. The nights were the worst. In the darkness, whispers spread like wildfire through the hold. Stories of what the Americans did to prisoners, tales of experiments and torture, rumors of women who had disappeared without trace. Some wept quietly into their thin blankets, while others lay rigid with terror, staring at the ceiling and listening to the ship's mechanical heartbeat. The metal groaned constantly, a lullaby of dread that followed them into fitful dreams. On the 5th day, the weather turned rough. The ship pitched and rolled violently, sending the women sliding across the deck. Many became violently seasick, retching into buckets that American sailors emptied without complaint. Again, the prisoners found themselves confused by this practical kindness. Where was the expected cruelty? Where were the beatings and humiliations they had been promised? One sailor even brought extra blankets for the sickest women, his face showing what appeared to be genuine concern. As the Pacific stretched endlessly before them, the women began to realize that their journey was taking them not just across an ocean, but across the boundaries of everything they thought they knew about their enemies and themselves. Each sunset brought them closer to a reckoning they could not yet imagine. The American coastline appeared through morning mist like a mirage made real. After 2 weeks at sea, the women pressed against portholes and crowded onto permitted areas of deck, staring at a land that seemed impossibly intact. Where Japan had been reduced to skeletal ruins and ash-covered wasteland, this enemy territory revealed green hills, towering buildings, and harbors bustling with ships that gleamed in the sunlight. The contrast struck them like a physical blow, each woman confronting the devastating reality of how completely their homeland had been shattered. Yuki stood at the ship's rail, watching San Francisco Bay unfold before them. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched across the water like a monument to impossible engineering, its towers reaching toward clouds unmarked by smoke or fire. Behind her, Michiko gasped audibly, pointing at the city's skyline where buildings stood intact, their windows catching light instead of gaping like empty eye sockets. This was the land of demons they had been taught to fear, yet it looked more like paradise than any place they had ever seen. The docking process began with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized their entire journey. American officials boarded the ship carrying clipboards and speaking in calm, measured tones. The women were organized into groups, their names checked against lists, their few possessions cataloged with methodical precision. No one screamed orders, no one struck anyone who moved too slowly. The absence of expected brutality created an atmosphere more unsettling than violence would have been. Keiko whispered to those around her. They treat us like packages to be sorted, not enemies to be punished. The observation rippled through the group, each woman processing this strange reality according to her own fears and expectations. Some found the civility more terrifying than cruelty would have been, convinced it masked something far worse. Others began to feel the first stirrings of confusion about everything they had been taught to believe. The gangplank stretched before them like a bridge between worlds. As they descended onto American soil, many women instinctively bowed deeply, a gesture of respect and submission that felt both necessary and humiliating. The dock workers, mostly American men in work clothes, watched them with expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. A few pointed or whispered among themselves, but there were no jeers, no thrown objects, no spitting faces of hatred they had been promised. Buses waited to transport them inland, their yellow paint bright against the gray of the harbor. The women climbed aboard hesitantly, many touching the seats with wonder. The upholstery was intact, not patched or worn through. The windows were clean, offering clear views of a world that seemed to exist in a different universe from the one they had left behind. As the buses pulled away from the dock, they began their journey through American streets that defied every image of enemy territory they had carried in their minds. Through the windows, they watched ordinary Americans going about their daily lives. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks, their laughter audible even through glass. Women pushed baby carriages past shop windows filled with goods that sparkled in afternoon sunlight. Men in clean clothes read newspapers while sitting on park benches surrounded by flowers that bloomed in carefully tended gardens. The abundance was overwhelming, almost obscene in its stark contrast to the rationed desperation they had known for years. "Look at their children," Michiko murmured, watching a group of American boys playing baseball in a park. "They're fat. Actually fat." The observation carried no malice, only stunned disbelief. In Japan, children had grown thin and hollow-eyed, their growth stunted by years of inadequate nutrition. Here, young faces were round and healthy, their movements energetic rather than listless. The sight challenged everything they had been told about American weakness and moral decay. The journey to the internment camp took them through farmland that stretched green and fertile to distant horizons. Cattle grazed in fields that showed no signs of bombing or burning. Barns stood intact, their red paint bright in the sunshine. Farm equipment sat ready for use rather than melted into twisted metal. This was a land that had never known the thunder of enemy aircraft, never felt the earth shake under falling bombs. The realization settled into their consciousness like a stone dropping into still water, creating ripples of understanding that would forever change how they saw their own country's fate. As the buses approached the camp gates, the women fell silent. Ahead lay barbed wire and guard towers, the familiar architecture of captivity they had expected from the beginning. Yet even here, something felt different. The buildings were painted, the grounds maintained, the fences intact but not menacing in the way they had imagined. American soldiers stood at attention as the buses passed through the gates, their faces showing neither cruelty nor kindness, simply the professional detachment of men doing a job they understood to be necessary. The buses came to a stop inside the compound, and the women prepared to face whatever fate awaited them. But even in this moment of arrival at their place of imprisonment, they carried with them the image of that impossible coastline, those intact cities, those healthy children. America had revealed itself to be something their propaganda had never prepared them to encounter. The camp gates closed behind them with a metallic clang that echoed across the compound. But what followed defied every expectation carved into their minds by years of propaganda. American guards directed them toward a low building marked with signs in both English and Japanese characters. The translation was unnecessary. The universal symbol for bathing was clear enough. The women exchanged terrified glances, their worst fears seeming to materialize before their eyes. This was where the humiliation would begin, where their dignity would be stripped away along with their clothes. They filed into the building reluctantly, each step heavy with dread. Inside, steam rose from multiple shower heads, and the air smelled of soap rather than the disinfectant they had expected. American female attendants, not soldiers, waited with stacks of clean towels and bars of white soap. The soap was real, solid, fragrant with a scent that reminded some women of flowers they had not smelled since childhood. Yuki held her bar up to the light, examining it as if it might be an illusion that would dissolve in her hands. "They want us clean before," Keiko's voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought that tormented them all. The women undressed slowly, their movements stiff with shame and fear. But as the hot water cascaded over skin that had not been truly clean in months, something unexpected happened. No one laughed at them, no one pointed or jeered. The American attendants worked efficiently but respectfully, offering fresh clothing and ensuring each woman had everything she needed. The water was impossibly hot, a luxury that many had forgotten existed. As Yuki stood under the spray, she watched months of grime and exhaustion wash away in dark rivulets at her feet. Around her, other women wept quietly, their tears mixing with the shower water. Some cried from relief, others from confusion, and many from the overwhelming guilt of finding comfort in their captor's care. The soap lathered rich and white between their fingers, nothing like the harsh caustic bars they had used in Japan's final desperate months. When they emerged from the showers, clean clothes waited for them. Simple dresses in blue cotton, undergarments that were new and soft, shoes that actually fit their feet. The contrast with their filthy, worn uniforms was startling. Michiko stared at her reflection in a polished metal mirror, hardly recognizing the clean face that looked back at her. "I feel human again," she whispered, then immediately covered her mouth as if the words were treasonous. The barracks assigned to them were simple but adequate, rows of beds with actual mattresses, clean sheets folded at the foot of each bunk, windows that let in natural light. This was not the concrete cells or underground pits they had imagined. The floors were swept, the walls painted, the air fresh and breathable. Some women tested their mattresses tentatively, pressing down to confirm they were real. After sleeping on rice straw mats and bare floors, the softness felt like an impossible luxury. Their first meal in the camp mess hall delivered another shock to their understanding of captivity. Long tables stretched across a room that smelled of cooking food rather than the thin gruel they had expected. American cooks served portions that seemed enormous, rice with vegetables, meat that was actually meat, bread that was white and soft. The women approached their trays with suspicion, convinced that such abundance must be a cruel trick designed to torment them before the real punishment began. Yuki bit into a piece of bread and had to steady herself against the table. It was sweet, made with real wheat flour and perhaps even sugar. In Japan, bread had become a memory, replaced by sawdust mixtures that barely sustained life. Here, in their enemy's prison, they were being fed better than they had eaten in their own homes during the war's final year. The contradiction was almost unbearable, challenging everything they thought they knew about honor, loyalty, and the nature of their captors. As days passed, the routine of camp life revealed further impossibilities. They were assigned work details, some in the kitchen, others in a laundry facility, still others maintaining the campgrounds. They were paid wages in camp currency that could be used to purchase items from a small store: chocolate, cigarettes, writing paper, even lipstick. The idea that prisoners could earn money, could make choices about small luxuries, seemed to exist outside any framework of captivity they had imagined. Keiko found herself working in the camp garden, tending vegetables that would feed both prisoners and guards. The irony was not lost on her. She was growing food for her captors, yet she was allowed to eat the same vegetables herself. The soil was rich and dark, unmarked by bomb craters or chemical contamination. Plants grew strong and healthy under American sun, their leaves green and abundant in ways that Japanese crops had not been for years. In the evenings, the women gathered in their barracks, whispering conversations that grew more complex as their initial terror gave way to confused contemplation. They were alive, clean, fed, and treated with a dignity that their own leaders had rarely shown them. The enemy they had been taught to hate was revealing himself to be disturbingly, confusingly human. Letters from home began arriving 3 weeks into their captivity, each envelope carrying news that made their comfortable imprisonment feel increasingly surreal. The American censors had stamped the correspondence with official seals, but the contents remained largely intact, delivering reports from a Japan that seemed to exist in a different universe from their current reality. Yuki read her family's letter by lamplight in the barracks, her hands trembling as she absorbed words that painted a picture of devastation beyond imagination. "We boil tree bark for soup," her mother had written in shaky characters. "Your father searches the rubble for anything that might burn. The children from next door have not eaten in 3 days. If you have anything, send it to us." Yuki folded the letter carefully, her throat tight with guilt. Around her, other women shared similar reports: families living in caves, children dying of malnutrition, entire cities reduced to ash and despair. The contrast with their own situation was crushing. Michiko's letter brought news even worse. "The radiation sickness spreads," her aunt had written from what remained of Hiroshima. "People's hair falls out, their skin turns black. We cannot bury the dead fast enough. The city smells of death and burning, and nothing grows in the soil anymore." Michiko stared at the paper for a long time, then looked around the clean barracks with its comfortable beds and adequate heating. The inequality felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. The work details took them outside the camp compound more frequently now, into American towns where the abundance grew even more overwhelming with each exposure. They picked fruit in orchards where trees bent heavy with apples and pears, more food rotting on the ground than entire Japanese villages had seen in months. They cleaned offices and buildings that had never known the touch of war, where electric lights burned bright and wastepaper baskets overflowed with discarded plenty. In a small town near the camp, Yuki found herself assigned to help in a local church's charity drive. American women sorted through donated clothing, much of it barely worn, destined for European refugees. The irony was staggering. These enemies were sending aid to strangers across an ocean while their own prisoners lived better than most Japanese civilians. Yuki watched an American woman hold up a child's coat, checking for damage, and realized the garment was of higher quality than anything she had owned even before the war began. The American guards began to treat them less like dangerous prisoners and more like unfortunate guests. Some learned basic Japanese phrases, attempting conversations that bridged the language barrier with gestures and smiles. A young corporal named Thompson brought his radio to the recreation area in the evenings, playing American music that filled the air with rhythms the women had never heard. Some found themselves humming along, their bodies swaying unconsciously to foreign melodies that somehow felt universal. Keiko discovered that her English, learned in school before the war, allowed her to communicate with the guards more effectively than others. Through these halting conversations, she learned that many of the American soldiers had lost friends and brothers in the Pacific War. Yet they showed no desire for revenge against their captives, no cruel satisfaction at Japanese suffering. Their professionalism seemed genuine, their treatment of prisoners guided by rules and regulations rather than personal hatred. The camp store became a source of daily wonder and torment. With their earned wages, the women could purchase luxuries that had vanished from Japanese life years earlier. Real soap that smelled of lavender, chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, magazines filled with photographs of American abundance. Yuki bought a tube of lipstick, then stared at it for hours without opening it, overwhelmed by the guilt of possessing something so frivolous while her family starved in ruins. Letters they wrote home were censored, but not heavily edited. They found themselves struggling with what to tell their families about their treatment. How could they explain the hot showers, the adequate food, the absence of torture and humiliation? How could they describe the kindness of guards whose countries had been at war for 4 bitter years? Some chose to write only of their longing for home, omitting details that might sound like boasting about their comfortable captivity. The psychological weight of their situation grew heavier as autumn approached. They were prisoners, yet they lived better than their own families. They were enemies, yet they were treated with more dignity than their own government had shown them. The propaganda that had shaped their understanding of Americans crumbled a little more each day, replaced by a complex reality that defied simple categorization. Michiko began questioning everything she had believed about the war itself. If Americans were capable of such humanity toward their prisoners, what did that say about the stories they had been told of American brutality in combat? If this enemy nation possessed such abundance and organization, how had Japan's leaders convinced them they could win a war against such power? The questions multiplied like cracks in a breaking foundation, threatening to bring down the entire structure of her beliefs. As winter's first frost touched the camp fences, rumors began circulating about eventual repatriation. The thought of returning to Japan filled them with dread rather than joy, for they knew they would be trading abundance for starvation, comfort for ruin. The announcement came on a cold December morning, delivered by the camp commander with the same bureaucratic efficiency that had characterized their entire captivity. Repatriation ships would begin departing in the spring, carrying them back to a Japan that existed now only in their memories and nightmares. The women received the news in stunned silence, their faces reflecting emotions too complex for simple classification. This was what they had supposedly wanted, what they had prayed for in those first terrifying days aboard the transport ships. Yet now, the prospect of leaving America filled them with a dread deeper than their original fears of captivity. Yuki sat on her bunk that evening, staring at the small collection of possessions she had accumulated during her months in the camp. A tube of lipstick, barely used, a chocolate bar she had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive, writing paper and pencils purchased with wages earned from washing American uniforms. These simple objects represented more luxury than she had known in years of war, yet she would have to leave them behind or carry them back to a homeland where such abundance would seem like evidence of betrayal. The letters from home had grown increasingly desperate as winter deepened. Families reported eating grass and tree bark, burning furniture for warmth, burying children who had simply stopped breathing in the night. Michiko's latest correspondence brought news that her aunt had died of radiation sickness, her body finally succumbing to the invisible poison that lingered in Hiroshima's ruins. The woman had lived long enough to write one final message. Tell Michiko that America feeds her better than we could feed ourselves. Perhaps that is justice. In the camp workshop, Keiko had learned to sew with American machines, creating garments from fabric that was clean, colorful, and abundant. Her hands had grown soft again, her fingernails clean, her posture straight from adequate nutrition and rest. When she looked in the mirror now, she saw a healthy young woman whose face bore little resemblance to the gaunt, hollow-eyed creature who had boarded the transport ship months earlier. How would her family react to her transformation? Would they see her improved health as evidence of her collaboration with the enemy? The American guards, sensing the women's complicated emotions about repatriation, made quiet efforts to prepare them for the transition. Medical examinations ensured they were healthy enough for the journey. New clothes were issued, simple but sturdy garments that would survive the long voyage home. Some guards who had developed friendly relationships with the prisoners struggled with their own conflicted feelings about sending these women back to a devastated country. Corporal Thompson, the young soldier who had shared his radio music with them, approached Yuki one evening as she walked the camp perimeter. His broken Japanese mixed with her limited English as he tried to express something that transcended the barriers between former enemies. "Japan will be better," he said slowly, searching for words. "American help, rebuild, not always war." His kindness was genuine, but Yuki wondered if he truly understood what awaited them across the Pacific. The weight of their impending departure forced each woman to confront the transformation that had occurred within her own mind and heart. They had arrived as prisoners filled with hatred and terror, convinced that Americans were demons who would destroy their bodies and souls. Instead, they had discovered enemies who showed mercy, who treated prisoners according to rules of human dignity that Japan itself had rarely followed. The revelation was more devastating than any physical torture could have been. Yuki's diary, now filled with months of observations and confessions, had become a record of psychological transformation that she feared to share with anyone. "They have broken us," she had written, "not with cruelty but with kindness. They have shown us what we could have been, what our country might have become if we had chosen differently. How do we return home carrying this knowledge? How do we face our families knowing that we have lived in paradise while they suffered in hell?" The final weeks of winter brought a strange melancholy to the camp. Friendships had formed between guards and prisoners, tentative bridges built across the gulf of war and ideology. Some American soldiers had learned enough Japanese to hold simple conversations, while several women had mastered basic English phrases. These connections would be severed by repatriation, leaving both sides to wonder what might have been possible in a world without war. As spring approached and the first repatriation ships prepared to depart, the women faced a truth that none could speak aloud. They were afraid to go home. America had fed them, clothed them, treated them with dignity, and shown them glimpses of a world where abundance was possible, where enemies could show mercy, where different peoples might coexist without mutual destruction. Now they must return to ruins and starvation, carrying with them the burden of having experienced the enemy's unexpected humanity. The soap that had shocked them in those first days had become a symbol of everything they had discovered and everything they would lose. In their captors' simple gesture of providing clean water and fragrant soap, they had found a dignity that their own leaders had denied them. Soon, very soon, they would sail back across the Pacific, carrying these revelations into an uncertain future where such truths might be too dangerous to share.